I'm pleased to welcome Adrian Fitzgerald from Denton, Corker Marshall.
Thank you very much. It's very nice to be here. This evening I thought I'd try and do, rather than the show and tell of the projects, try something a little bit more ambitious, which is to take one step back and look at our work in terms of its design vocabulary, if you like, which is, and doing that, particularly focus on the formal and the form giving and the aesthetic aspects of our work. So that'll be really the first half of what I'm going to talk about. Then I'll touch on some other preoccupations that inform their work, and then just look at one project in particular, the Manchester Civil Justice Centre. But as a starting point for that notion of form, and I'm not attempting a history lesson here, but clearly there's been a long tradition in architecture which is the notion that function follows form. And that was really the neoclassical tradition, where the Greek temple and the Roman form was the starting point, and it was practiced through the Beaux-Arts academies, and it was primarily preoccupied with a formalistic aesthetic, where you could take any building type. It could be a museum, as in the British Museum by Robert Smirke. It could be a library in Victoria. It could be a courthouse in Washington, or it could be a bank, or it could be a theatre, or anything else. But the idea was the form was the dominating starting point. And it's curious, just looking at this is 1823 and we're up to 1935. And that was the prevailing view. Of course, there was other architecture being built at similar times, and industrial architecture in particular, where form absolutely followed function. It was the complete reverse of that proposition. These are some beautiful photos taken by some German artists who have catalogued and collected a lot of industrial archaeology, architecture of the 20th century. They happen to be cooling towers, lime kilns, blast furnaces. But every decision of where the pipe went or the structure projected was totally based on a functional decision, not by an architect, but an engineer, a designer nonetheless. I should say, perhaps just going back to that previous slide, of course all these buildings are great examples of their type, and they're all heritage listed. So they are significant pieces of architecture in their own right. Now, the modernists really rejected the function following form idea and created the notion of form following function. So they in effect looked, and Corbin and Co. and Gropius looked at the industrial architecture and other broader architectures, marine architecture, and saw that there was another proposition. I think it was Louis Sullivan really first coined the phrase, which was shortened into form followed function. Gropius and the Bauhaus championed it. And its preoccupation was with clean, efficient buildings. The aesthetic was functionalist. These are just a set of examples. They could have been any, but of the great modernist pieces, Mies in Illinois, Korb, the Assembly Building in Chandigarh, Alto, a later building, where you can see overt expression, a stair gets expression and becomes part of the aesthetic, the simplicity. Now, what of course happened was, while they rejected the previous Beaux-Arts position, over time they developed their own distinctive vocabularies about their own forms and the materials and the way they expressed them. So that really got us to, I suppose, Venturi, who put the proposition that it didn't have to be either or. It could be both, which is sort of the point in time in which we operate. So the guilt that form had to follow function, which was a modernist idea, is now no longer. We don't have to carry that burden around with us. We can be willful and play with form. But of course, we also want those forms to have some functional origin. So I'm now going to just look at a few recurrent preoccupations in our designs, bearing in mind that what I've just set out. Now, I suppose a clear starting point for us, or not a starting point, but a background reference is modern art, certainly abstraction, and that could be any one of dozens of Rothkos, or it could be the forms of Richard Serra. But we certainly see our architecture as art. We don't adhere to that functionalist view, the clear view. So here we are in Warsaw, proposal for the British Embassy. Simple Platonic form, then the pattern, clearly Mondrian inspired. And the beauty of that facade pattern, of course, is it allows the windows to be placed exactly where you want them in response to the internal activities, which inherently a random pattern allows you to do. So once you've thrown out the symmetrical Beaux-Arts and embraced the simplicity of the abstract art forms, we can do what we want with facades. The Melbourne Museum, assemblage of elements which clearly are occupying and enclosing activities and functions, but they're an expression of an art, of the idea of architecture as art. Of course, we commonly use the sculptural virgate elements such as the sticks. Now, the sticks is an obvious one. Obviously, it's a column. Here we are at the exhibition centre, or a forest of columns which inhabits the space, which becomes the forecourt, the entry, the portico. And they're holding up the structure of the roof above. The big yellow sticks hold up the major blade, which is the entry symbol of the building. And then they run down along the full length of the concourse and form a giant urban veranda. And they have a dynamic lean, which has to do with the aerodynamic roof shape and has a structural logic to it, but it also has a poetic expression of movement. So the stick width is something we played with a lot. At the exhibition, the Delphi Hotel, they're holding up the sign, but they also have moved into the facade. They have become part of the mullion systems that are part of the glazing. They're expressed in colour, which is a current idea of ours, to try and break down the architecture into elements and then express those elements so that when the junction occurs, I suppose one of the greatest creations of the modernist was probably the shadow gap, which got away with all that excessive covering and has allowed us to express all the elements. At the simplest, a stair balustrade could be made of 3 sticks, as we did at Emery Vincent's office many years ago, and a bunch of sticks. 30 sticks could form a gateway to the city on the expressway. And at the grandest scale, 120 metres, they become markers. This was, of course, on the Balti Bridge. We were invited in. The bridge had already been designed by engineers. We were told you couldn't question any of the basic engineering. All we were asked to do was come in and give it something more than the engineers could do, dress it up, as it were. So we did that in simple terms by overcladding to give it a different shape. We put an edge to it, a folded edge. But the big sticks were really about its place as a bridge. It's a vast span across the Docklands basin, and it had to deal with the scale of the city, and the bridge didn't do that as a horizontal, the sticks did. They form absolutely no functional purpose as in engineering, so we deliberately displaced them. They have no connection whatsoever with the actual bridge structure. But their functional purpose, if you like, is highly symbolic to the notion of entry, arrival, gateway, city. And then, of course, the stick. The beauty of the stick is it can take on any sizes, so we can work it as an element, and it's perfect at 120 metres. And I guess this is our smallest stick to date, which is a handle on a Lessie espresso cup. Because espresso is only a few shots of coffee, so you didn't have to deal with burning your fingers. So the stick actually works surprisingly well. Going through this sort of elemental language, the blade is another one. And this is the wall memorial. Now, all of these forms, they're types, and they can obviously have many, many interpretations. Here we see blade as a wall, and I'll come back and talk about this project a little bit more later on. A blade becomes a marker for the entrance, the front door at Marshall House at Phillip Island. Blades can, of course, be folded and become gateway markers in residential developments in China. Tube is another one, another form that is a recurrent one in the Emery House. I mean, the tube is a perfect container for the Miesian plan form, and I think Rob may have shown one of Mies's classics, the plan earlier. The Mies house, which of course Merkert uses perennially in his plans and with minor adaptations, and it's a good plan, it's a sensible plan for the way it does arrange a house. So we have that same form clad in a tube, make it as thin as possible on the edges, which is a particular preoccupation of ours, which is the tectonics of how to put things together and try and express the thinness possible. This is Tube House, my own place in Carlton. In the inner city, tiny little block down a lane, terrace house dimensions, had to deal with all the usual issues of overlook on neighbours. So a linear shaped block essentially didn't want windows on the side to do with those overlooks. So the tube form, it's 3 stories. You're seeing the top 2 floors, and they only have openings at the north and south, other than some little grills that give some air and light to the bathrooms. But a very logical form for the house type. The tube doesn't have to be square. This one is what's called the sound tube. It's out on the freeway. You can see the sticks to the gateway beyond. Its purpose was to give sound protection to the high-rise housing commission adjacent to it. So it was really needed a sound wall. The most effective way to contain sound is to enfold it. Then the issue was how to hold that up. Well, why not envelop the total freeway? Fortuitously, it has it drops and it has a slight curve. So the combination of the two makes it a very exhilarating ride through, and I no doubt you've seen it. I think we've counted nearly a dozen TV commercials made inside that space. A wall doesn't have to be a wall. It doesn't have to join at a junction and turn another angle. A wall, in effect, is just a plate that's standing vertically. So why not express it as a plate, as we did at the Monash School of Art and Design, Caulfield campus. And the reason the plate had a logic, it was fronting the main road, major 6-lane highway. So there's considerable sound issues. It's a school of art and sculpture. The workshop spaces in behind, getting southern light. So the building became a massive billboard, a plate apparently held up on very thin sticks, and of course has become the image of the faculty. A different version of a plate at the Sheep Farmhouse, the entrance courtyard, a very zen-like garden experience of gravel, a grove of trees, but one large plate and a hole cut in it, which denotes entry. And there's a certain simplicity in that which always appeals to us. On the other side of that wall is the house itself, almost like a lean-to, a roof really expressed as another set of plates, which has the house proper opening up onto the sunny side and looking out across the landscape. The Wilson House, which we completed last year, won an award. Simple proposition on a hill, dramatic setting up in the Yarra Valley. It sits on some large, overscaled abutment pieces, and the proposition is really 2 plates, which contains a version of a Miesian house plan. Again, this is the southern side, so the orientation, north, sun, etc. And the pursuit of the plate in here, not only is the house in essence squeezed between 2 plates, but the plate itself is apparently made of 2 plates, and that's really our desire, just to try and get that absolute thinness to the reading. It has the dramatic cantilever, which is another theme we like to play with. At a very different sort of level, this is low budget housing in China, where the perennial issue of the balconies and the air conditioning units that the developers won't provide, the owners have to come along and plug them on, and they usually stick them all over your facade. So the re-entrant behind the plate became the zone for the outdoor units. And a plate can, if you keep going down the plate language, you could fold it and it can wrap around and form an enclosure. This is, again, in China, a sales suite for a large development that turns into a clubhouse. Grids have preoccupied architects for forever, I suppose, or certainly in modern times. Just a little play on here at the Tokyo Embassy, where 2 grids became a 3-dimensional enclosure for the Australian emblem, the kangaroo and the emu, which were offset and moved optically and only came into correct alignment in terms of the emblem, the key point standing in the middle of the entrance driveway. Again, China grids, simple solution, utilising colour, so the opening windows get buried in the colour panels, which are really just stuck onto the glazing system. But within that language, the opportunities for the abstract colour. The grid can warp, become a web. These are more of these clubhouses in China. Or the web can totally deform and become more organic, as in the web bridge. Now, the web bridge is not called web bridge because of the web that's enclosing it, but it was actually the name of the original railway bridge across the river. The competition, it was a design competition we won down in Docklands. You had to keep that existing structure. It was at a high level to do with the clearance for boats, and you had to get from the existing structure down to the new river edge, and it had to be compliant to disability regulations 1 in 14. So that implied a ramp of a certain length. You couldn't just do it like that, so hence the big loop, which was a direct response to how to create that required length to achieve the gradient. Then it was enclosed in a set of hoops, and to hold the hoops up, it needed some struts because we wanted to keep the hoops as thin as possible. And then once you put the struts and start modelling in 3D, of course, you can just start making this amazing web structure, which then was documented in 3D and handed over to the contractors who built it from that. They actually sailed segments of the bridge already prefabricated up the river and put it in place when the tide was correct. An alternate on the web, a very large shopping centre in Beijing, about twice the size of Chadstone, which encompasses 4 city blocks out on the 3rd Ring Road. The client wanted to use the roofscape, wasn't happy with his whatever it is, nearly 200,000 square metres of space within the buildings. He also wanted to use the roof space, which was above the permitted height limit. So the solution was to give him a roof web which satisfied the planners that we weren't really building and occupying above the height limit, but provided within that small pavilions inhabit that space, and there's indoor-outdoor activity, so he can commercialise his roof. And the experience down below, the roof is this fantastic scale of web made up out of metal panels held again in place by incredibly thin sticks. That one is nearing completion. Another idea in terms of the building form, so that's very much looking a bit about elements that make up buildings, but of course the form of the building itself could be as simple elemental forms as well, in this case sort of stacked supra-scale upon one another. Here we see a high-rise tower proposition for Asia, for a commercial tower, a set of cubes that stack and offset. Another one in the Middle East for an invited competition, where the brief was the client had in mind to build a large, very tall office tower, but he wanted it to, in effect, be a series of somewhat discrete buildings so that he could rent or lease or sell the space to individuals. So one corporation could come along, the Hong Kong Shanghai Bank could have that as their individual building, as it were, in the sky, and others. So there were direct lifts to these individuals, so quite a complicated, fragmented form at a simpler scale, and built in Jakarta, a hotel which has a set of cubes stacked at the top, which become the public spaces in the hotel. The census building in Melbourne, as part of the QV site that Rob showed you earlier, where the entrance really became a series of boxes that become the marker for entrance up in Brisbane, the Brisbane Square Tower, which was very curious. It wasn't willful on our part to create one form and then create another and push it back. It was an absolute direct response to the client's requirements. The developer was Suncorp. They wanted to occupy the top floors. They sublet the bottom to the Brisbane City Council. The Brisbane City Council wanted a large open plan floor, so the box extended and encapsulated the core at that point. And then to assist in holding it up, we created these incredibly tall and slender columns that then had some spiders to hold them in place. The shaft, which I suppose is another version of a stick, but you could obviously make a building out of that, which we've done. In that previous drawing has been built in Hong Kong, one of those amazing little finger towers, which is only, well, I'll go back, I'll talk to it just briefly, but it's a 190 square metre floor plate. So we thought in Wan Chai, where you get these tiny little lots, and you find the similar sort of buildings in Tokyo, extraordinary buildings. So we thought, well, that has a beautiful slenderness to it. Well, why don't we just accentuate that even further by breaking it into 2 shafts, so they look like 2 little buildings held up against one another. A version of stacking shafts. Again, this is this mid-range sort of housing, not big budgets, but in China, where simplify the housing back. It's the perennial issue of, as Rob talked on, that forever repeating nature of residential just stacked on top of one another. But perhaps the most poetic idea for the notion of the big shafts is our building 4 at the brewery site. I think this is Rob's building sits here. We won the competition for the large tower as part of this site. Its significance really in Melbourne, it's on the axis, the famous Swanston Street axis, which continues down to the shrine. And it used to be the joke about Melbourne that the whole city could be summed up in the shrine at one end of the whole city was based on a formal axis with a shrine at one end and a brewery at the other. Now, the brewery is gone, but the debate was, should the axis be closed? Should it be open? Should it be infinite? The city grid is Hoddle's grid runs that direction. Carlton grid takes a twist and runs in a different direction. So in fact, the axis sort of peters out into the Carlton grid, and Rob's building will be a low, Rob and Debbie's building will be a low marker. From the other direction, there is an apparent marker. I mean, we put the proposition, it was inappropriate to put a commercial building of a developer as the end marker, as much as the brewery once existed, and it was, you know, there is the old joke. It really was inappropriate to mark this ceremonial axis with a commercial building. However, by putting a very tall stick from a distance, it will be the apparent, so which appealed obviously to the ego of the developer, that he could do that and also be responsive. So there's the axis continuing up between the slot of the building in the centre that's proposed. And the beauty of this form is, in planning terms, it creates a lot of corner offices which are highly sought after in fit-outs. The finger is another variant of a horizontal version, but you could stack them up. And the fingers in Brisbane Square, now we're looking at the bottom side. In the podium, the City Council occupies their offices, and then all their community services are in the podium with retail under. So the notion was to express those community uses and invite and engage the public via these very vibrant coloured fingers. A little one with a little bit of analysis, a project in Beijing. This was the building control envelope. Rather unpromising, a bit stumpy, broad, had a curve, had a fall across it. So the strategy was really to break that up into a set of fingers in plan. They then stepped to do with setbacks on the curve and propped in and out to create entrance points, etc. Take that notion, stack it vertically. Again, they step to do with height, lift them off the ground to allow covered entry, and then put them together and put some larger urban windows into them. And that's it built the fenestration to get around the perennial issue of offices where they demand a certain amount of glazing, which on your facade creates the classic sort of stripes that you see all over office towers around the world. We were able to use two glass types, one very dark and one silver reflective, such that the silver reflective one looks very similar to the panelling and gives the illusion of these incredible little slot windows. Lines is something that we've engaged with in the landscape. This was our first proposal for the visitor centre at Stonehenge, where we buried the centre. The actual stones that form the ring are really quite delicate in scale, quite monumental because they're massive pieces of stone, and they sit out on the Salisbury Plain where it's virtually flat without trees. But in scale terms, they're about that size, and this is the visitor centre, which was much larger, although it was a distance. So the proposition was to essentially bury the building, put it in the landscape, so that and make no reference whatsoever to the notion of stone. So these were to be zinc-clad plates that you moved through and then went on to experience the building. Ribbons. This is a competition we did in China where for 4 buildings, a library, a concert hall and a museum gallery with a large exhibition hotel. So the idea was to link those civic buildings into one and create the undulating ribbon, the dragon-like form. overclad. The library proper occupied a zone here. The zone in between is really just a large porte cochere, so it had a simple space frame, and then it's overclad, and then you got the concert hall and the museum gallery, and with the dramatic cantilevers on the end. We won the competition, and then it went up to the mayor, who then gave the job to some of his cronies, which is often the way in China. A variant of a ribbon idea, shopping centre, Bondi Junction, where breaking down the big box, which is typical of the shopping centre, and getting some glass into it, and then enclosing it with a ribbon-like cladding. Ribbon form in housing. China. This is a job we're currently working on, which is the new law courts, criminal courts in Birmingham. A difficult site with a brief that needed to occupy a lot of the site. When I say difficult, a specifically shaped site. So the end solution really was a ribbon building with some expressed boxes that accommodate some of the meeting functions. A couple of other preoccupations. The notion we really enjoy challenging the limits of gravity, which we did with the gateway, the big cheese stickers it's sometimes called. I guess we had in mind more the boom gate that lifts up and down. It's an 80-metre cantilever. Now, it's a square hollow section which inherently is structurally very stable. All it needed was a large concrete anchor set into the ground to hold it in place. And similarly, the sticks that are, from memory, 15 or 18 metres, same principle. And the beauty of them and designing, which we have discovered on this sort of freeway work, is it's experienced largely at 70, 80, 90 kilometres an hour. So it's not static design in the way you might experience most buildings. So it has to be very broad gestures and really very simple. I think the freeway walls and things that don't work are where they get far too delicate and busy from our point of view. They're big elements. Defying gravity, the entrance blade, which was a marker. It was to be a signal. We had the casino next door with all its extravagance and gas balls going off at night. And this was to try and mark its presence. This, of course, building was built when all of the rest of this zone was a bit of a wasteland, and which no one went down to. It's obviously changing now, but that was its rationale. Here's the big cantilever at Wilson House, 15 metres, quite simply done by a truss which has a backspan that runs for the full length of the house. So essentially not a terribly difficult structural proposition, but nevertheless one where we just have to push the engineer hard to achieve it. We like the use of colour. The saturated colours, of course, are something that we're fascinated with and employed, again, in the exhibition centre, in the lobby, used with Gary Emery in conjunction in the concourse as markers for orientation, readability for the various halls. Then we often set some sort of abstract rules for ourselves, which are really about providing order and some kind of clarity and readability. In the case of the museum, which was an international competition, we had the Royal Exhibition Building, World Heritage listed, highly significant structure, very classical. The dome is the marker. So we took that, we set that as the symmetrical point for our building, and we put the big blade roof, which was the late 20th century response to the dome in terms of a 20th century piece of architecture, and it enclosed the Gallery of Life. Then the proposition was a campus of uses. There are many different galleries within it, and to give them identity, they inhabited the the museum proper. It had to deal with entrance off Nicholson and Rathdown, hence to bring the front door to the centre. Otherwise, you had that dilemma of, if this was the entrance, what was this? Well, they both obviously had to be the entrance because they are both major arterials in the grid system. To hold it together, we proposed a grid which was to have a series of photovoltaic panels, as shown in that model from the competition scheme. They fell off during some value engineering, but the grid stayed intact, and it's built, and it does serve a variety of functions, such as holding the entrance, covering canopies that do bring you into the centre. And then once you've set those sort of rules for yourself, you can always then start transgressing the rules via the unexpected or the random. In this case, in housing in solution, there's a grid, sets up an order to the building, allows the different uses, the balconies, to sit within it. And then there's an overcladding, which is to be read at a broader urban scale. These are a set of aluminium rods. They had some sun shading purpose, but they weren't inherently essential to that. We had to argue very hard with the developer to do this, and he was totally concerned it would obstruct views and no one would buy his apartment. So we persuaded him to do a mock-up on a prototype, and because, as we all know, it's like the Venetian blinds. You look straight, when they're in the open position, you look straight through, and your perception in your eye tells your brain there's the view, and it joins the cars or trees or whatever beyond up. So they went ahead and built it, and then they sold the units and the owners took occupancy, and the developer came back and said, oh, now, the owners down here are upset they haven't got one of these. But often all you're dealing with in residential is the expression of the balcony. It's the same plan, stacked up, repeated. So all we can often play with is that balcony, and it's this notion that we can really pursue as much randomness. Here we are just jumping the balconies around as much as we can. And it's just really to do with our desire and for functionality and buildability will permit. So there's a sort of a pursuit of random order, if you like. And here again, for more variations, balconies, jump them around in China. This is the Olympic housing proposal. We have a portion of it for Lend-Lease for the London Olympics. Lend-Lease wanted, the original brief was it was all to be made out of precast from Eastern Europe. And it's very simple housing. It's actually quite small units. Each one of those represents a unit, and it had to conform to all the developers' requirements of repetition and so on. We weren't able to persuade them, as in QV, that you might do anything else. They're fairly hard-nosed developers. Anyway, all we were able to suggest was within that precast system, by changing colour, you can then start creating other patterns within the essential grid, which is the housing. And so you can get differentiation. Balconies can be stick-like elements. There are lifts, of course, in this, and we said we could enclose the lift with more sticks on the top, but if you don't like them, they could go. So I don't know if they're in or out at the moment. So look, that's that notion really about formal pursuits. I'll just pick up on a couple of other ideas, because our architecture is informed by many other things. Now, we work all over, like many practices nowadays, we practice globally. We're in many different cities and locations and countries. And all those individual cultures and contexts are always a point of departure in our schemes. We largely designed from Melbourne. Melbourne's head office. It's really where we have what we call a design cell. And we do that because over time we've had different regional offices, but we've really found to maintain the design quality control and maintain the standards that we want, it's better to centralise it. So I'll just talk, how are we going on time?
5 to 10.
Okay, good. All right, well, I've got a few projects in here which I will illustrate how they are very specific responses to their cultural and contextual situations. This, of course, is Canberra. Griffith's Plan, the land axis from Mount Ainslie across to Parliament House, Anzac Parade, and the War Memorial sits at the end of it as a marker. We've worked with the War Memorial now for over 20 years as a client. The first building we did was a small administration building. The original 1930s, I think, building is actually quite delicate in scale, although it has a certain monumentality because of its design with very small openings and windows, and so it's hard to read the scale until you get up close to it. So we've had a series of commissions, the Anzac Hall, a big exhibition space, and another facility added to it, and internal work. But the proposition has been to really defer to this. This is clearly the primary building. It is strongly axial, it's formal, I suppose, art. So the admin building was deliberately descaled. It was a 3-storey building. By berming it up to it, and then it really appears as only 2 stories, and then by making the openings from a distance appear to be large single openings, it actually looks like a single-storey building, and you can see what I'm talking about with the scale of this building, which again has, in a different way, has small openings, which gives it its apparent monumentality, but it really is only a sort of 3-storey building with a dome. So this was a particular contextual response to make it regressive. The T-sections, all out of steel, were clearly referencing the memorabilia held within the memorial. We opened up the original quarry and cut the same stone. That was done back in the 80s. This one was completed, the Anzac Hall, 4 or 5 years ago. A very large exhibition space which has fighter jets, submarines, very large objects in it. It had the potential to really dominate, again, the War Memorial. So it's submerged into the landscape, it's bermed, and it's expressed as a very simple wing-like stealth bomber form that has a blade wall that really just gives, from the axial view, just sits as a backdrop. So again, deferring to the original. A classic picture, a classic house, and a classic response to a very sensitive landscape setting. Barry Marshall's house, built 20, 25 years ago now at Kittymilly Bay, where it's a square, the house proper is in this form, and it's, again, buried in the landscape. The dunes run across the top. Highly sensitive to that setting. Some of you wouldn't know this, but this was we were in the shortlist for the Federation Square competition, and this was our proposition. And the point I'm making, as per the caption, is that we don't conceive architecture on a blank page. They really do belong to their particular urban or public realm. In this case, the site always had contours that ran up from the river edge back to the city, and we reflected that in the forms. There's a reading of those contours which allowed us to deal with the gradient up. We proposed digging out so you drop down and actually being able to pass through the bluestone arches. Then in more recent times, the tracks and the lines of the tracks, and they're expressed in the architectural form, which a series of fingers, a series of these folded or curved glass plated roofs. A very large part of the competition brief was for a garden, and so we brought the park in through the building. Now, curiously, in the lab scheme, that requirement seemed to drop out of their proposal. However, that's how we engaged both of those, and then we took one of these forms and turned it into a big vertical marker, which was to become a viewing platform. So Melbourne didn't need a wheel. They could have had their own viewing tower. This is the Forbidden City in Beijing. Excuse me. Extraordinary complex, highly formal, of course, on that axis, the north-south axis, of this sequence of pavilion, wall, gate, enclosure that leads you ever closer to the centre and being the point of where the emperor inhabited. We first experienced this back in the 80s when China was starting to open up and Australia built the first Australian embassy. The power of the walls, this is a photo I took when I went there in 1983. These extraordinary walls, just unbelievable. The big pots were the firefighting system. They were filled with water in the event that there was a fire. So the wall really informed the way we did the Australian embassy, which was a contemporary version of it. It was pretty rudimentary construction techniques back in those days. We were allocated the old communist system, construction brigade number 5, so there was no competitive tendering or any of that. You were just handed, this is the contractor. So the standards were pretty hit and miss. Hence we used what they could do well, which was render on concrete, and the enclosure of the walls helped. Fairly harsh climate, and you get the winds come in at certain time of year from the Gobi Desert blowing the dust in. So there's a sequence of gardens with the residents in beyond. A more recent competition in Beijing, and this is the History Museum, Chinese History Museum on Tiananmen Square. So it's on that right side of that, if you can imagine that aerial view I showed of the Forbidden City. This is the existing building, which had some heritage status, and it was an extension to it on the back, as it were. Our proposition, without going into any great detail, I'll just quickly make a few points. Our proposition was 8 cubes. 8's a very propitious number in Chinese culture. A museum, by its definition, does not want a lot of light, and so solid forms were ideal with windows in the re-entrance breakout. And the idea was to clad the forms in metal sheets in 2 types, titanium and bronze, which it was all broken down into a grid system that then had a language of strokes that you can get a hint of here. So within a single grid there were 9 possibilities, and then of course by rotating those horizontally and you could get a pattern emerging, and then by manipulating the combination of how many strokes of one colour or the other, you could get these sort of webs, textures emerging. And the notion was the end cube, the southern cube, would be mostly bronze, and then progressively more titanium dashes, and that talked, if you like, about history and the notion of movement through time. And titanium was obviously of material of our current era, and bronze was something to do with the past. And of course they had references in a variety of things. I mean, the first topography, this is the first topography invented in the world, and it had this wonderful pattern and these wonderful colours. And, you know, Chinese calligraphy has all these characteristics, but so do microchips in computers. So museums of history are not just about the past. I mean, the present is history in the making. So that was all some of the cultural references that we tried to embed within that scheme. Here it is, has the very simple forms, Platonic forms. A different sort of exercise in Shanghai. This is the famous Bund, the great mercantile frontage to the city onto the river, built all in the 30s and 40s. In fact, quite extraordinarily, of all those buildings, all at bar one, were designed by one architectural practice, Palmer and Turner, out of Hong Kong, a firm that still operate under the name PT Architects. And it had all the banks and the primary government buildings of its time. The proposition we were involved in was a competition, invited competition, well, consultancy really, SOM from San Francisco, Portman's office from America, a German practice, and ourselves, to come up with proposals for the extension of this, what they called the South Bund, an area roughly the same, come up with a master plan proposition which then became the development controls, and the site would be sold on to a developer. So the analysis of the original form, which is the 10 buildings, we took that as a key to, this is the scale of the South Bund, similar size, a set of buildings of a similar breakdown, albeit much taller, to do with the development controls. And this is the emergent. The last building, I think you can just see there, which is on the Bund itself, there's a park, and then this is the new proposition that leads down to some existing taller towers. So breaking down, setting up a language about simple stacked cube forms that were to have a series of lanterns embedded in them that were to be landscape green zones. A major requirement for this planning exercise was to address energy use. For those who are familiar with Shanghai, it's extraordinary the amount of illumination they put on buildings, but it's obviously highly energy wasteful. So our proposal was, rather than floodlit the buildings, you would in fact just light the lanterns, and then you could achieve the same strong dramatic effect by way of silhouette viewed across the river, but by a far more energy conscious way. So last couple of points, and then I'll just run into Manchester if we've got time. I'll close up quickly. All right. Sustainability, big part of our work. Of course, we always pursue beauty, defined in our whole terms. I'll race through these. This is just, obviously the way I've presented it, it may give a false picture. Architecture, of course, is a very, and particularly on large buildings, very complex exercise. There's a lot of things to be taken into account when designing. This is the Manchester Civil Justice Centre, won in an invited international competition against Richard Rogers and Pringle Partners from Manchester. The site, triangular piece of land in the spinning fields, an old industrial regeneration zone. We often think that one good idea, one big idea is probably enough to hang your whole architecture around. And in this case, our proposition was anyone who's going to court is usually in a certain state of agitation and stress. You don't end up in court unless, and that's for both parties. So you want a building that is as de-stressing as possible, i.e. it needs to be highly readable, clear, legible. You can't get lost. There aren't dead-end corners. You know where you're going. You know where you should be. So that was the proposition, that there would be a concourse, circulation zone, public zone. There was a spine that had lifts and all the servicing, and then there were the courts proper, and that they have a judicial corridor by which the judges come. So that was the plan. These are from the original competition drawings, submission. And then that extruded itself in section, where the yellow zone, the public space, only had to go to a certain height, then it was offices above, the spine, and the court fingers. And there it is, built. So that plan that transformed itself into a section is essentially what got built. It's made up of a large grade screen. In the atrium space is occupied by a series of meeting pods. The public concourse, the spine wall has all the servicing. You move through, and the courts. There's 52 courts, varying inside from a tribunal, which is a very small room, to a super court that had, for large commercial cases, with up to 30 solicitors, barristers, and the mix changed over time. We said, our form can accommodate that. The fingers can grow, and in fact, as the plan developed, they did. And then there's what we call an environmental veil, which was all part of a very ambitious environmental strategy, which was to have a mixed mode ventilation system. 80% of it is naturally ventilated, or rather for 80% of the year it's naturally ventilated via prevailing winds that come in wind scoops on the end of the spine wall into light air ducts that's passed through the courts. They're in these vast ducts. It had to get a brim rating, a specified brim rating. To achieve that, it had to be low velocity air, i.e. we couldn't mechanically assist it with fans or we'd lose points in the rating system. So there's this massive duct, 2 metres by 6 metres, very slow air moving. It comes out of these ducts through the courts and expels itself out. So there's a whole series of louvers, hence the environmental veil is a device for screening that. We were able to get, by holding the judicial corridor down low, we could get natural light into the courtrooms itself. And this is one of those courts in the Fingers. So you get views out, you get light coming in from above, and you get ventilation coming out of these points in the floor. It's gone on and won the RIBA National Sustainability Award on top of another 20 odd awards. It's been an extraordinarily successful building. Here we are in the atrium. There's a double wall construction. So it's a double glazed unit, albeit blown up 600 wide. One of the advantages of that is you don't have to have the black spaces that you typically find in double glazing, and so it has extraordinary transparency that you lose once you use the standard double glazed unit. You're in the atrium looking up. These are some of the pods that occupy it. It's a fairly tall space, very high floor to floor because of the various requirements. So to avoid any sort of vertigo effect, it's occupied by the pods, some of which have one of our signature colours. And that's the last image, which finishes it. Thank you.
Thank you, Adrian. Sorry about the technical difficulties. That was certainly a great reminder of how much impact your firm has had on the city of Melbourne and its character. I great to see that character being spread around the world in all those fabulous projects.